In the vastness of space, where 1,000 different species had risen to claim their place among the stars, there existed one universal truth that every civilization understood. Some fights were never meant to be won by the weak. For 3 millennia, the Galactic Combat Federation had stood as the ultimate proving ground, where the strongest warriors from across the galaxy gathered to test their might in ritual combat that decided the fate of entire worlds. The arena floors had been stained with the blood of champions from species that could shatter mountains with their bare hands, whose reflexes moved faster than light itself, whose very presence could bend the will of lesser beings. Victories here didn't just bring glory, they brought power. The right to claim new worlds, to expand territories, to subjugate weaker species under the ancient laws that governed galactic civilization. Humanity had been watching from the shadows for decades, dismissed as another soft species from a backwater planet, barely worth the attention of the galaxy's true powers. They were farmers and builders, scientists and dreamers, certainly not warriors. At least that's what everyone believed. But on this day, as the great arena filled with roaring crowds from 100 different worlds, as the reigning champion, a towering beast from the war world of Krextar, prepared to defend his title against yet another challenger, something unprecedented was about to happen. Something that would shatter every assumption the galaxy had ever made about the small, seemingly fragile beings from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. She was just a human woman, standing barely 6 feet tall, her frame looking almost comically small against the massive arena walls that had witnessed the fall of giants. But in her eyes burned something that the galaxy had never seen before in a human contestant: the quiet, terrifying certainty of someone who had never learned how to quit. The galaxy was about to learn why humanity had survived every extinction event their home world had thrown at them. They were about to discover what happened when you cornered the descendants of persistence hunters, of survivors who would climb to the top of their world's food chain, not through raw strength, but through something far more dangerous: the absolute refusal to give up. Her name was Sarah Chen, and when she stepped into that ring, she carried with her the hopes of an entire species that had been underestimated for far too long. The galaxy would never be the same. The morning of the challenge dawned like any other on Station Omega 7, the massive orbital platform that served as the galaxy's premier combat arena. Merchants hawked their wares in 17 different languages, while betting pools reached astronomical figures. The air hummed with excitement, and the distinctive smell of cooking food from dozens of worlds mingled with the metallic scent of the arena's recycled atmosphere. Sarah Chen stood in the challenger's preparation chamber, her hands wrapped in the traditional combat bindings, staring at her reflection in the polished metal wall. 26 years old, born on Luna Colony, raised on stories of Earth's greatest fighters, she had trained her entire life for this moment. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her lean frame showed the results of years of disciplined conditioning. To most observers, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be: another sacrifice to the entertainment of the masses. The door chimed, and her trainer, Marcus Webb, entered, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Real Earth coffee, worth more than most people's yearly salary out here in the deep systems. His weathered face carried the scars of his own fighting days, back when humans first started appearing in the lower-tier competitions. He had never made it to the championship level, but he had taught Sarah everything he knew about reading opponents and finding weaknesses that others missed. "You don't have to do this," he said for the 100th time, offering her the cup. "The Federation Council accepted our petition for protected status. Humanity's got a seat at the table now. We don't need to prove anything to anyone." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring the familiar taste that reminded her of home. "That's exactly why I have to do this, Marcus. A seat at the table isn't enough. They gave us that seat because they pity us, because they think we're harmless enough to ignore." She took another sip, then set the cup down carefully. "I'm not doing this for glory or prize money. I'm doing this so that when humans speak in the Galactic Senate, other species actually listen." The preparation chamber's viewing screen flickered to life, showing the main arena where over 200,000 beings from across the galaxy had gathered. The crowd was a living tapestry of diversity that still amazed Sarah even after months of preparation. Crystalline beings from the silicate world sparkled like living diamonds in their environmental suits. Massive tusked creatures from the heavy gravity worlds of the Tarian sector took up entire sections with their bulk. Graceful, six-armed humanoids from the Centauri systems moved like living artwork through the crowd. And in the center of it all stood the arena itself, a perfect circle of smart metal that could reshape itself to provide any environment a fighter might need. Today it had configured itself as a simple flat platform, giving no advantage to either combatant. The morning's preliminary matches had already concluded, each one a testament to the incredible diversity of ways different species had evolved to fight and survive. "Current champion," the announcer's voice boomed through the station's speakers, translated into every known language simultaneously, representing the Krekstar Empire, undefeated in 47 matches, winner of 6 consecutive Grand Championships, Vorth the Bonebreaker. The crowd's roar was deafening as the champion emerged from his preparation chamber. Vorth stood nearly 12 feet tall, his hide thick as armor plating, with 4 powerful arms that ended in claws capable of rending steel. His species had evolved on a death world where everything from the weather to the plant life actively tried to kill you, and they had responded by becoming living weapons. Scars covered his body like a roadmap of violence, each one representing a battle survived and an opponent defeated. The Krekstar were one of the galaxy's dominant military powers, and their champion's continued success in the arena was a source of immense pride for their empire. More importantly, it was a source of political influence. The ancient laws of the Combat Federation granted the champion species significant authority in galactic affairs, including the right to claim new territories and resources. Vorth raised all 4 arms to acknowledge the crowd's cheers, his massive head turning to scan the assembled beings with eyes like burning coals. He had held the championship for 3 years now, and each successful defense only added to his legend. Bookmakers throughout the galaxy had stopped taking bets against him in serious matches, only accepting wagers on how quickly he would finish his opponents. And now, the announcer continued, his voice carrying a note of what might have been amusement, representing the Terran Federation in their first-ever championship challenge, Sarah Chen of Earth. The reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the thunderous approval that had greeted Vorth, there was a ripple of confused murmurs and scattered laughter. Many beings in the crowd had to consult their translation devices to understand what Earth even was. Others knew of humanity, but considered them one of the galaxy's more harmless species, useful for their diplomatic skills and engineering capabilities, but hardly the stuff of warrior legends. Sarah felt the weight of their dismissal as she walked through the tunnel toward the arena proper. The smart material walls shifted color as she passed, responding to her biometrics and displaying a simple readout of her vital statistics. To anyone who bothered to look, the numbers were unimpressive by galactic standards. Her strength levels were a fraction of what most species considered adequate for serious combat. Her speed was respectable but hardly exceptional. Even her bone density was laughably low compared to beings who had evolved under multiple gravities. What the readouts couldn't measure, however, was the peculiar form of madness that had allowed humans to survive and thrive on a world that had tried to kill them in every conceivable way for millions of years. They couldn't quantify the stubborn refusal to quit that had seen her species climb from the trees to the stars in the blink of an evolutionary eye. And they certainly couldn't account for the thousands of hours Sarah had spent studying footage of every champion fight for the past century, looking for patterns and weaknesses that others had missed. As she stepped into the arena proper, the scale of the moment hit her fully. The curved walls rose up around her like the inside of a massive bowl, every surface packed with spectators whose attention was now focused entirely on her. The arena floor felt solid beneath her feet, but she knew it could shift and change at a moment's notice if the match required it. Above her, the great dome showed the starfield beyond, with Earth's sun visible as just another point of light among millions. Vorth was waiting for her at the center of the arena, his massive form making her look like a child who had wandered onto a battlefield by mistake. Up close, his presence was even more intimidating. His breathing created small wind currents that she could feel on her skin, and the temperature in his immediate vicinity was noticeably higher than the surrounding area. He looked down at her with something that might have been curiosity, as if she were an interesting insect he was about to step on. "Little human," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone, "you have made a mistake coming here. I will try to make your death quick, as a kindness to your species." Sarah looked up at him calmly, showing none of the fear that was hammering in her chest. This was the moment she had trained for, planned for, dreamed of, since she was old enough to understand what the championship meant for humanity's place in the galaxy. She thought of her parents watching from Earth, of the children in the colonies who had sent her messages of support, of every human who had ever been dismissed as too weak, too soft, too insignificant to matter in the broader scope of galactic civilization. "Thank you for the consideration," she replied, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet arena. "But I didn't come here to die quickly. I came here to show the galaxy something they've never seen before." The referee, a floating sphere of crystallized energy from one of the neutral species, drifted between them to explain the rules. Standard championship combat. No weapons, no enhancement drugs, no outside assistance. Victory by knockout, surrender, or death. The ancient laws would be observed, and the winner would claim not just the title, but the political authority that came with it. As the referee withdrew to a safe distance, Sarah felt time slow around her. This was it, the moment that would define not just her own fate, but the future of human involvement in galactic affairs. She had one chance to prove that her species was more than the galaxy's assumption of them, one opportunity to show that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one everyone underestimates. The starting signal rang out across the arena, a pure tone that cut through the crowd's noise and signaled the beginning of what most observers expected to be a very short fight. Birth moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator, his massive form belying the speed with which he could strike. His strategy was simple and effective. Use his superior reach and strength to end the fight before his opponent could establish any kind of rhythm or momentum. But as his first crushing blow swept towards Sarah's position, something unexpected happened. She wasn't there anymore. Her smaller frame had allowed her to slip under his attack with movements that seemed almost like dancing, flowing around his assault, rather than trying to meet it head-on. It was the first hint that this fight might not go exactly as everyone expected. The crowd's murmur grew louder as Sarah continued to evade Vorth's attacks, never quite where he expected her to be, never quite moving in the patterns his experience suggested she should. She was fighting like something the galaxy had never seen before. Not with the straightforward aggression of a warrior species, nor with the defensive tactics of a weaker race trying to survive. She was fighting like a human being, with all the adaptability and persistence that had carried her species from the caves to the stars. And for the first time in 3 years, the champion found himself having to actually work for his victory. The fight had been going for 20 minutes now, and what had started as casual entertainment for the crowd had evolved into something none of them had expected to witness. Birth, the seemingly invincible champion, was showing the first signs of fatigue. His massive chest rose and fell with labored breathing, and a thin sheen of perspiration covered his armored hide. More troubling for him was the growing frustration visible in his movements as he continued to fail to land a decisive blow on his seemingly fragile opponent. Sarah, by contrast, looked like she was just getting warmed up. Her movement patterns had evolved throughout the fight as she learned to read Vorth's tells and timing. What had started as desperate evasion had become something more sophisticated, a flowing, adaptive combat style that seemed to turn the champion's own strength and aggression against him. Every missed attack left him slightly off balance. Every failed grab positioned him exactly where she wanted him to be for her countermoves. The crowd had grown quieter as the minutes passed, their initial amusement giving way to genuine interest and then to something approaching concern. This wasn't how championship fights were supposed to go. Champions didn't get tired. Champions didn't look confused or frustrated. Champions certainly didn't spend 20 minutes chasing around opponents who, by all rights, should have been crushed in the first exchange. In the diplomatic viewing boxes reserved for government officials and species representatives, conversations were taking on an increasingly urgent tone. The Krextar ambassador, a smaller but no less intimidating version of Vorth himself, was gripping the railing of his viewing platform with enough force to leave claw marks in the metal. Around him, representatives from other species were beginning to reassess their assumptions about both the human challenger and the implications of what they were witnessing. Down in the arena, Vorth was beginning to realize that his usual tactics weren't going to work against this opponent. His species had conquered half a dozen worlds through straightforward application of overwhelming force, but force meant nothing if you couldn't bring it to bear effectively. The human moved like water, flowing around his attacks and somehow always ending up in positions where she could strike at his joints and pressure points while remaining out of range of his devastating counterattacks. "You fight like a coward," he growled, his voice carrying a note of genuine anger for the first time in the match. "Face me properly, little human," just for a moment, and smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm fighting exactly like a human," she replied. "We don't win fights by being stronger or faster than our opponents. We win by being smarter, more adaptable, and too stubborn to quit." As if to emphasize her point, she launched herself at one of Vorth's knees with a precision strike that took advantage of his species' anatomy. Her research had shown that Krextar joints, while incredibly strong, had a specific weak point where the cartilage was thinner. It wasn't enough to cause serious damage, but it wasn't enough to make him stumble and create an opening for her to score several quick strikes to his ribs before dancing away from his retaliatory swipe. The crowd's reaction was immediate and mixed. Some species that valued cunning over strength began to cheer for the human challenger, while others seemed almost offended by her tactics. This wasn't how their warrior traditions suggested fights should be conducted, but they couldn't argue with the effectiveness of her approach. Marcus watched from the trainer's area, his weathered face showing pride and concern in equal measure. He had taught Sarah to fight, but what he was seeing in the arena went beyond anything he had shown her. She was improvising, adapting, learning her opponent's patterns in real time, and adjusting her strategy accordingly. It was like watching evolution in fast forward, and it was both beautiful and terrifying to behold. She's not just fighting him, he murmured to himself. She's solving him like a puzzle. That was exactly what Sarah was doing. Every failed attack from Vorth gave her more data about his reaction times, his preferred striking patterns, his balance points. Every minute that passed was a minute she spent learning while he grew more frustrated and sloppy. Humans might not have evolved as natural predators, but they had evolved as persistence hunters, beings who could track their prey for days or weeks, wearing them down through sheer relentless pursuit until exhaustion made them vulnerable. The arena's environmental systems were beginning to work harder as Vorth's body heat increased with his exertion. Steam rose from his hide where sweat evaporated, creating a light fog around his massive form. His attacks were becoming wilder, less controlled, driven more by frustration than tactical thinking. Sarah could see the change in his posture, the way his stance had shifted from confident predator to increasingly desperate hunter. She began to press her advantage, not with increased aggression, but with more precise targeting. Her strikes focused on nerve clusters and joint connections that would accumulate damage over time rather than trying to achieve a single knockout blow. It was a strategy that would have been impossible for most species to execute, requiring the kind of detailed anatomical knowledge that only a technologically advanced civilization could provide. Combined with the physical capability to actually exploit that knowledge under combat conditions, the turning point came in the 32nd minute of the fight. Worth, growing increasingly desperate, attempted a four-armed grab designed to immobilize Sarah long enough for him to crush her against his chest. It was a powerful technique that had ended many of his previous fights, but it required him to fully commit to the attack with all of his limbs extended. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment. As Vorth's massive arms closed around the space where she had been, she dropped low and rolled between his legs, coming up behind him with a clear strike at the base of his spine where his species' nervous system concentrated. The blow wouldn't have been enough to seriously injure a being of Vorth's physical resilience, but it disrupted his balance at the exact moment when he was most vulnerable. The champion stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him toward the arena wall. Sarah was already moving, using his own mass against him as she guided his fall with precisely applied leverage. The impact when he hit the wall sent vibrations through the entire arena structure, and for the first time in his championship career, Vorth found himself on the ground with his opponent standing over him. The crowd fell completely silent. This simply didn't happen. Champions didn't end up on their backs. Champions didn't look up at smaller opponents with expressions of genuine surprise and growing respect. The implications of what they were witnessing were beginning to sink in, and the political ramifications were staggering. But Vorth was not defeated yet. Rolling with surprising speed for someone of his size, he swept Sarah's legs and sent her tumbling. As she recovered, he pushed himself back to his feet, his breathing now labored but his eyes showing a new kind of focus. The playful contempt was gone, replaced by the serious attention he normally reserved for only his most dangerous opponents. "You are not what your species appears to be," he said, respect audible in his gravelly voice. "But I am still champion, and I will not lose to anyone, human or otherwise." Sarah nodded, acknowledging both the compliment and the renewed threat. She was tired too, though not as visibly as her opponent. The constant movement and precise timing she had been maintaining required its own form of endurance, and she could feel the accumulated fatigue in her muscles. But she also felt something else, the growing certainty that she could actually win this fight. "Then let's finish this properly," she replied, settling into a fighting stance that combined elements from a dozen different earth martial arts with adaptations she had developed specifically for this match. Time to show the galaxy what humans can really do when we stop holding back. The final phase of the fight was about to begin, and both combatants knew that only one of them would be leaving the arena as champion. Around them, 200,000 beings from across the galaxy held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something that would change the political landscape of galactic civilization forever. Sarah thought of Earth, of all the humans who had ever been dismissed as too weak, too soft, too civilized to compete with the galaxy's warrior races. She thought of her ancestors who had survived ice ages and plagues, who had built civilizations from nothing and reached for the stars when everyone told them it was impossible. And she felt the ancient fire that had driven humanity from the caves to the cosmos burning bright in her chest. It was time to remind the galaxy why her species had earned their place among the stars. It was time to show them that sometimes, the most dangerous opponent is the one who refuses to know when they're beaten. The final round was about to begin, and Sarah Chen was ready to make history. The silence in the arena was deafening as both fighters prepared for what everyone understood would be the final phase of their battle. 43 minutes had passed since the opening bell, making this already the longest championship fight in over a decade. More importantly, it was the first time in 3 years that Vorth had been forced to acknowledge an opponent as a genuine threat rather than mere entertainment. Sarah could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Every human in the galaxy was watching through various broadcast feeds. Every alien species was reassessing their understanding of what humanity might be capable of. But most immediately, she was facing down 400 pounds of evolved killing machine who had finally decided to take her seriously as an opponent. Vorth's fighting style underwent a fundamental shift as the final phase began. Gone were the wild, overpowering attacks driven by frustration and contempt. In their place was the calculated precision that had made him champion in the first place, the tactical brilliance that his species had developed through countless generations of warfare on their death world. He began to move with purpose rather than rage, cutting off Sarah's escape routes and forcing her into increasingly difficult positions. The change was immediately apparent to everyone watching, where before Sarah had been able to dictate the flow of the fight through superior mobility and tactical thinking, she now found herself responding to Vorth's initiatives rather than creating her own opportunities. His massive frame no longer seemed clumsy or unwieldy. It was a weapon deployed with surgical precision, each movement calculated to minimize her advantages while maximizing his own. "Now you see the real champion," he rumbled as he advanced on her position, his forearms working in perfect coordination to limit her movement options. "I grow tired of games, little human. Time to end this properly." Sarah felt the shift in momentum immediately. This was what she had been preparing for during the long months of training. The moment when her opponents stopped underestimating her and brought their full capabilities to bear. She had known from the beginning that she couldn't win a straight fight against a being of Vorth's physical capabilities. Her only hope had been to tire him out, frustrate him, and force him to make mistakes. But now he had adapted to her tactics, and she needed to find a new approach quickly. The next exchange demonstrated just how dangerous Vorth could be when he focused. His attacks came in perfectly coordinated sequences that forced Sarah to expend enormous amounts of energy just to avoid being caught. Where before she had been able to counterattack after each evasion, now she found herself purely on the defensive, using every technique in her repertoire just to stay alive. A massive fist whistled past her head with enough force that the wind displacement knocked her off balance. Before she could recover, a second arm was already swinging toward her midsection. She managed to get her guard up, but the impact sent her skidding backward across the arena floor, her boots leaving scorch marks on the smart metal surface. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some cheering for the champion's renewed dominance, others genuinely concerned for the human challenger who had given them such an unexpectedly compelling fight. In the diplomatic viewing boxes, conversations had taken on an urgent tone as representatives began to realize that the implications of this fight extended far beyond simple entertainment. If Sarah won, an increasingly unlikely prospect, humanity would suddenly become a major player in galactic politics. The championship came with territorial rights, resource allocation privileges, and most importantly, the right to be heard and respected in galactic councils. But if she lost after coming so close to victory, humanity's reputation might actually be damaged rather than enhanced. They would be seen as a species that could be dangerous when underestimated, but ultimately lacked the strength to compete with the galaxy's true powers. Sarah herself was acutely aware of these larger implications, but she couldn't afford to think about them now. All her attention had to be focused on the immediate problem of surviving the next few minutes against an opponent who had finally decided to fight at his full capability. She was faster than most species gave humans credit for, but Vorth was faster than she had expected. She was skilled in combat techniques that few aliens understood, but he was learning to counter them in real time. As another devastating combination of attacks forced her to give up more ground, Sarah realized that she had been approaching this all wrong. She had been trying to fight Vorth as if he were a larger, stronger human. But he wasn't human at all. He was an alien being with alien reflexes, alien psychology, and alien weaknesses that she hadn't yet learned to exploit. The revelation came to her as she narrowly avoided a grab that would have ended the fight immediately. Vorth's species had evolved as apex predators on their home world, but they had also evolved in a very specific environment with very specific threats. They were perfectly adapted to fight other Krekstar, and the dangerous fauna of their death world, but they might not be as well adapted to face an opponent who fought in ways their evolution had never prepared them for. Sarah began to move differently, incorporating techniques that no reasonable fighter would use because they seemed to offer no tactical advantage. She started fighting in ways that violated every principle of effective combat that alien species understood, using movements that appeared inefficient or even counterproductive. To Vorth, trained by millions of years of evolution and decades of combat experience, her new approach looked like the desperate flailing of a defeated opponent. But there was method to her apparent madness. Humans had not evolved as natural predators, but they had evolved as the most adaptable species their world had ever produced. They had learned to hunt in packs, to use tools, to change their behavior patterns faster than their prey could adapt. Most importantly, they had learned to think their way out of problems that other species would solve through strength or speed alone. Sarah's new fighting style wasn't designed to overpower Vorth or even to outmaneuver him in any conventional sense. Instead, it was designed to do something that no opponent had ever tried in the championship arena, to be so unpredictably human that his alien psychology couldn't process and counter her attacks effectively. The change in her approach had an immediate effect. Vorth, who had been gaining momentum and confidence, suddenly found himself dealing with an opponent who seemed to be fighting in ways that made no tactical sense. Her movements violated everything his combat training had taught him about efficient fighting techniques, but somehow they were still effective at keeping her alive and even creating opportunities for her to score minor hits. More frustrating for him was the psychological impact of facing an opponent whose behavior patterns he couldn't predict or understand. Krekstar psychology was built around dominance hierarchies and territorial control, concepts that made perfect sense when fighting others of their species or similar warrior races. But Sarah was fighting like something outside those frameworks entirely, and it was deeply unsettling in ways that Vorth couldn't quite articulate. The turning point came when Sarah did something that no rational fighter would ever attempt in a championship match. As Vorth closed in for what should have been a finishing combination, she deliberately threw herself backward in a way that put her in a seemingly vulnerable position on the ground. Every instinct Vorth possessed told him to take advantage of her apparent mistake and end the fight immediately. But as he committed to the attack, Sarah revealed what she had really been doing. Her apparent fall had been carefully calculated to position her exactly where she needed to be, to strike at a weakness she had identified through careful observation, a spot where Vorth's heavy musculature created a small gap in his natural armor plating. Her strike wasn't powerful by galactic standards, but it was precisely targeted and delivered at exactly the right moment when his own momentum amplified its impact. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Vorth's nervous system, designed to deal with the straightforward trauma of combat on his death world, wasn't prepared for the specific type of nerve disruption that Sarah's precisely targeted strike had caused. His legs buckled, not from damage, but from temporary neural confusion, and for the second time in the fight, the champion found himself on the ground. This time, however, Sarah was ready to press her advantage. Moving with the fluid precision that had carried her through 45 minutes of combat against impossible odds, she positioned herself to maintain her advantage, while Vorth struggled to understand what had just happened to his body. For the first time since the fight began, the crowd could sense that the unthinkable might actually be possible. The human challenger might actually be about to defeat the galactic champion. The implications of such an outcome were staggering, and as Sarah prepared to either claim victory or face Vorth's final desperate counterattack, 200,000 beings from across the galaxy held their breath and waited to see which species would be writing the next chapter of galactic history. The arena had never been quieter. 200,000 beings from across the galaxy watched in stunned silence as the impossible unfolded before them. Vorth the Bonebreaker, undefeated champion of the Galactic Combat Federation, lay on the arena floor struggling to regain control of his own nervous system while a human woman barely half his size stood ready to claim victory. But even as Sarah prepared to deliver what should have been the finishing sequence, she could see that the fight was not quite over. Vorth's eyes still burned with the fierce determination that had carried him through 47 consecutive victories. His species had not conquered half a dozen worlds by giving up when the situation looked hopeless. Even with his nervous system disrupted and his body refusing to obey his commands properly, he was already working to overcome the effects of her attack through sheer force of will. "Clever little human," he gasped, pushing himself up on his primary arms, while his secondary limbs still trembled from the nerve disruption. "But you have made one mistake. You have shown me that you can be hurt, and that means I can defeat you." Sarah knew he was right. The precise strike that had brought him down had required her to get closer than was safe, and she had felt his claws rake across her ribs as she escaped his counterattack. The wounds weren't deep, but they were bleeding, and more importantly, they had shown Vorth that her human physiology was even more fragile than he had initially assumed. If he could land one solid hit on her now, the fight would be over. Around the arena, the tension was becoming unbearable. In the diplomatic viewing boxes, representatives from dozens of species were frantically calculating the implications of what they were witnessing. The Krextar ambassador had gone completely still, his massive frame radiating barely controlled tension as he watched his species champion struggle against an opponent that should have been utterly beneath consideration. At the same time, the human diplomatic section was in chaos. Nobody had expected Sarah to get this far, and they certainly hadn't prepared for the possibility that she might actually win. The political ramifications were staggering. If Sarah claimed the championship, humanity would overnight become one of the major powers in galactic civilization, with all the responsibilities and enemies that such status would bring. But all of that political maneuvering seemed distant and abstract compared to the immediate reality of the arena floor. Sarah and Vorth circled each other warily, both fighters showing the accumulated damage of 50 minutes of intense combat. Sarah's breathing was controlled but labored, her movement still fluid but requiring increasingly conscious effort. Vorth was worse off physically, but his psychological state had shifted into something even more dangerous than his earlier rage, the cold, calculating fury of a predator that had been genuinely threatened. "You want to know the real difference between our species?" Vorth asked as they moved around each other, looking for openings. "My people learned to never give up, because our world tried to kill us every day. But your people learned to never give up because you were too stupid to realize when you were beaten." Sarah couldn't help but smile at that assessment, even as she prepared for what she knew would be Vorth's final assault. "You know what? You're probably right about that. We've never been very good at knowing when to quit." The last exchange came suddenly and with devastating intensity. Vorth, having finally regained full control of his motor functions, launched himself forward with every bit of strength and speed his massive frame could generate. It was a desperate all-or-nothing attack that committed everything he had to ending the fight in the next few seconds. Sarah met his charge not with evasion, as she had done throughout most of the fight, but with a direct counterattack that used his own momentum against him. It was a technique that required perfect timing and absolute commitment, because if she miscalculated by even a fraction of a second, Vorth's superior strength would crush her instantly. For one frozen moment, the entire arena held its breath as the two fighters came together in a collision that sent shockwaves through the smart metal floor. Then, slowly, the tangle of limbs resolved itself, and the crowd could see which fighter was still standing. Sarah Chen, bloodied and exhausted but triumphant, stood over the fallen form of Vorth the Bonebreaker. The former champion was not seriously injured, but he was clearly unconscious, having finally succumbed to the accumulated fatigue and trauma of a fight that had pushed him beyond his limits for the first time in years. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Nobody seemed quite able to process what they had just witnessed. Then slowly the reality began to sink in, and the arena erupted in noise unlike anything it had ever contained before. Some sections of the crowd cheered wildly for the new champion, caught up in the excitement of witnessing one of the greatest upsets in galactic sporting history. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to understand how their fundamental assumptions about human capabilities could have been so wrong. Still others argued loudly about whether what they had just seen was even possible, as if volume could change the reality of Sarah's victory. In the diplomatic sections, emergency communications were already being sent to governments across the galaxy. Trade agreements would need to be renegotiated. Defense pacts would require revision. The entire political balance of galactic civilization had just shifted, and nobody was quite sure what the new equilibrium would look like. But for Sarah, standing alone in the center of the arena as medical teams rushed to attend to both fighters, the moment was surprisingly quiet despite the chaos around her. She had done what she had come here to do. She had proven that humanity belonged among the galaxy's major powers, not through conquest or intimidation, but through the same stubborn refusal to give up that had carried her species from the caves to the stars. The referee, still struggling to process what it had witnessed, officially declared Sarah Chen the new galactic combat champion. The announcement triggered a fresh wave of noise from the crowd and a flurry of activity from the media representatives, who were already scrambling to understand the implications of this historic upset. As Sarah accepted the championship belt, a strip of smart metal that adjusted itself to fit her smaller frame, she thought about what this victory would mean for humanity's future in galactic civilization. They would no longer be dismissed as a minor species suitable only for diplomatic roles and technical support. They would have a voice in the councils that decided the fate of entire worlds, and the resources to back up their positions with more than just words. More importantly, perhaps, they had proven something that would echo through galactic history for generations to come. They had shown that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was not the biggest or the fastest or the most well-armed, but the one who simply refused to accept defeat. Marcus was the first to reach her as she left the arena floor, his weathered face showing pride and amazement in equal measure. "How does it feel to be the first human galactic champion?" he asked. Sarah considered the question seriously as they walked through the corridors beneath the arena, past crowds of beings who were now looking at her with very different expressions than they had shown when she first entered. Some showed respect, others fear. Many simple curiosity about what this small, seemingly fragile being had just accomplished. "It feels like the beginning," she finally answered. "We've proven that we belong here. Now we have to prove that we deserve to stay." Behind them, medics were helping Vorth to his feet. The former champion was battered and exhausted, but there was something like satisfaction in his eyes as he looked toward the tunnel where Sarah had disappeared. He had lost his title, but he had also been part of something unprecedented, a fight that had changed the galaxy's understanding of what was possible. As news of Sarah's victory spread throughout human space, celebrations erupted on Earth and every human colony. Children who had gone to sleep thinking of humans as a minor species in a galaxy full of giants woke up to find that their people had claimed their place among the powers that shaped galactic civilization. But perhaps more importantly, other species throughout the galaxy were beginning to look more carefully at their own assumptions about strength, weakness, and the value of different approaches to solving problems. If the humans could produce a champion when nobody expected it, what other surprises might the galaxy's supposedly minor species be capable of? In the years that would follow, Sarah's victory would be remembered not just as a sporting achievement, but as the moment when the galaxy learned that sometimes the most important battles are won not by those who are strongest, but by those who are too stubborn to know when they're supposed to quit. The ring had been just the beginning. Now humanity had to prove they could handle everything that came after stepping into it, and showing the galaxy that they belonged among the stars not as servants or junior partners, but as equals who had earned their place through the same determination that had carried them from their small blue world to the greatest arena in the galaxy. Sarah Chen had stepped into the ring as a representative of a dismissed species. She stepped out of it as the champion of beings who refused to be underestimated ever again. The galaxy would indeed never forget, just as the prophecy had suggested, but not for the reasons anyone had expected, when a small human woman first walked onto the arena floor and changed the course of galactic history forever.